The story of humanity is written not only in monuments and artifacts, but in the languages we speak. Every word carries memory, authority, and identity. Some languages rise to power, enabling administration, literature, and culture. Others fade quietly, suppressed by conquest, colonization, or deliberate erasure. What happens when a language is silenced? What knowledge, influence, and power vanish with it? Across history, civilizations have sought to control words as much as territory, and the languages they destroyed often contained secrets of their society's deepest knowledge. From the city-states of Mesopotamia to the empires of the Americas, entire scripts and tongues were erased, leaving historians and linguists to piece together fragmented legacies. In this narration, we will trace the stories of these lost languages, exploring the people who spoke them, the forces that tried to obliterate them, and the profound ways in which their disappearance reshaped civilizations. Sumerian is widely recognized as the first written language in human history, emerging in the southern regions of Mesopotamia, in the area that is now southern Iraq, circa 3100 BCE. It was a language of extraordinary sophistication, encoded on clay tablets with the wedge-shaped characters we now call cuneiform. These early inscriptions were not merely practical records, but also repositories of culture, law, and ritual knowledge. On April 17, 1929, the archaeologist Sir Leonard Woolley, working with his team at uncovered a remarkable collection of tablets detailing economic transactions, trade agreements, and temple offerings, as well as hymns and poetry dedicated to the gods of Sumer. These discoveries demonstrated that Sumerian was more than a means of communication. It was a powerful instrument of social organization, able to codify law, religion, and economy in a way that reinforced the authority of the elite class of scribes who mastered it. Each symbol carved into clay carried both administrative precision and the weight of cultural memory, binding the citizens of the city-states into a shared system of meaning and control. The Sumerian city-states, including Uruk, and Lagash, were highly stratified societies in which literacy was concentrated among an elite few. Scribes were trained from childhood in complex writing systems, spending years memorizing hundreds of signs and their myriad meanings. On May 12, 1934, Woolley's team unearthed additional tablets that contained religious hymns and incantations, revealing how language itself was used to assert power over both people and the spiritual realm. Through their mastery of Sumerian, scribes controlled the legal and economic apparatus of the state and mediated between the human and divine, creating a system in which knowledge and authority were inseparable. For ordinary citizens, the language of power was opaque. Their understanding of law and ritual depended entirely on intermediaries who wielded words as instruments of governance. This concentration of linguistic knowledge is one of the earliest examples in human history of how controlling language can translate directly into political and social power. Despite its monumental role in society, Sumerian eventually faced the pressures of both internal evolution and external conquest. Circa 2900 BCE, Akkadian-speaking Semitic peoples began settling in Mesopotamia, bringing with them a language that was increasingly used in trade, diplomacy, and daily life. Over the next millennium, Sumerian gradually ceased to be a spoken language, surviving primarily in the schools and temples, where it continued to be taught as a sacred and administrative tongue. By circa 2000 BCE, Sumerian had largely disappeared from everyday conversation, its voice echoing only through clay tablets and ritual texts preserved by scribes who still revered its cultural authority. This slow fade illustrates how even a language foundational to civilization can be overwritten by political shifts, migration, and the practical demands of communication. The disappearance of Sumerian did not happen overnight. It was a process of gradual absorption, replacement, and selective preservation that left the world with fragments of a once vibrant linguistic culture. The erasure of Sumerian was not merely a linguistic event but also an epistemological catastrophe. The language contained idiomatic expressions, metaphors, and grammatical structures that encoded ways of thinking entirely foreign to Akkadian. On August 3, 1945, the linguist Samuel Noah Kramer published translations of Sumerian poetry, noting that many concepts, especially those relating to social contracts, law, and religious philosophy, resist precise translation. In essence, the extinction of Sumerian meant the permanent loss of an intellectual framework that had shaped governance, ritual, and thought for centuries. Clay tablets and inscriptions provide glimpses of this knowledge, but the absence of living speakers left entire systems of meaning irretrievably altered, highlighting a pattern repeated throughout human history. The death of a language is inseparable from the erosion of cultural memory. Control over Sumerian was also control over power itself. By monopolizing literacy, scribes not only managed economic and administrative systems, but also shaped religious practice and social hierarchy. The language was a gatekeeper, deciding who could participate in legal proceedings, interpret divine will, and transmit history. When the spoken language began to vanish, this gatekeeping function slowly eroded, allowing Akkadian speakers to consolidate authority and reshape Mesopotamian culture according to their own linguistic frameworks. The interplay between language, knowledge, and dominance is evident here. Erasure was not random, but deeply political, reflecting shifts in power that reverberated through society and left an indelible mark on civilization. Even in the modern era, Sumerian continues to fascinate scholars and historians, offering fragmented insights into the earliest human attempts at writing, governance, and structured thought. Tablets preserved in Ur, Uruk, and other sites provide evidence of a society that understood the power of words and deliberately encoded knowledge in a medium that could outlast generations. Yet these surviving artifacts are only echoes of a language that once commanded the minds and spirits of an entire civilization. In studying Sumerian, we are reminded of the profound fragility of human knowledge and the enduring consequences when a language, the vessel of memory, authority, and identity disappears from the living world. Elamite was the language of the ancient kingdom of Elam, located in what is now southwestern Iran, and it existed alongside the earliest civilizations of Mesopotamia. It was a language of administration, religion, and elite communication, distinct from Sumerian and Akkadian in both structure and vocabulary. On June 15, 1901, the French archaeologist Jacques de Morgan and his team unearthed clay tablets in the ancient city of Susa, containing inscriptions in a script now identified as Linear Elamite. These tablets recorded administrative transactions, royal decrees, and religious dedications, revealing a society with a complex bureaucracy and rich cultural life. De Morgan noted in his field diary that the precision and organization of the records suggested that Elamite scribes wielded a power comparable to that of the Mesopotamian elite, controlling not only economic activity, but also the religious and political knowledge of the kingdom. The discovery was significant because it provided tangible proof that Elamite civilization was highly literate, capable of producing complex administrative and religious texts independent of neighboring cultures. Elamites' role in governance was extraordinary. Literacy was concentrated among scribes who were trained in specialized schools, mastering a script that was notoriously difficult to learn. On April 7, 1932, archaeologist Henri Frankfurt published a detailed analysis of additional tablets found in the Elamite royal archives at Susa, showing that the language was used to codify law, manage trade, and document temple rituals. These texts indicate that language itself was a tool of authority. Those who mastered it could interpret sacred rites, enforce contracts, and maintain the stability of the state. Ordinary citizens, by contrast, relied entirely on these literate elites to mediate their relationship with authority and the divine. In this sense, the Elamite language functioned as a form of power, a concept familiar throughout human history where knowledge was inseparable from control. Despite its significance, the Elamite language gradually declined under both internal and external pressures. Circa 645 BCE, Assyrian armies led by Ashurbanipal invaded Elam, sacking Susa, destroying temples, and decimating the royal archives. These conquests were devastating, disrupting the continuity of linguistic knowledge. Archaeological surveys from the 1930s and 1940s, studied by scholar W.F. Albright, show that even after the invasions, scribes continued to write in Elamite, producing religious texts and ceremonial inscriptions. However, the language increasingly ceded ground to Aramaic, which was spreading as a lingua franca across the region, favored for trade and diplomacy. Over the course of several generations, spoken Elamite disappeared from daily life, surviving only in ceremonial and scholarly contexts. Its gradual erasure illustrates that language death is rarely abrupt. It is a slow process shaped by conquest, cultural assimilation, and shifts in political authority. The disappearance of Elamite represents not just a loss of vocabulary, but a profound erosion of cultural and intellectual systems. On March 22, 1968, linguist David McAlpin published a comparative study suggesting possible links between Elamite and the Dravidian languages of South India. While his hypothesis remains debated, it highlights a critical point. When a language dies, we lose access to ways of thinking, historical connections, and subtle grammatical frameworks that shape thought. In Elamite, idioms and syntactic structures encoded concepts that are impossible to reconstruct fully in translation. This means that the extinction of the language erased not only daily communication, but also modes of reasoning, spiritual understanding, and administrative knowledge that guided one of the earliest complex civilizations in history. Elamite's power lay in its ability to mediate between the human and divine, the political and economic, and the local and regional. Royal inscriptions, temple tablets, and bureaucratic records were all written in a script understood only by the trained elite. By controlling this knowledge, scribes shaped the moral and legal landscape of Elam. Their ability to read and write was both a privilege and a source of authority, ensuring that language itself was a gatekeeper of influence. The eventual decline of Elamite reflects a recurring historical pattern. Languages tied to power are vulnerable when the structures that sustain them are destroyed or replaced. Conquerors do not only seize land, they seize the means of understanding and communication, erasing the intellectual framework of the societies they subjugate. Today, the fragments of Elamite, preserved on clay tablets and monumental inscriptions, are all that remain of a once dominant language. Scholars painstakingly piece together these remnants to reconstruct its grammar, vocabulary, and cultural context, yet much remains inaccessible. The study of Elamite teaches us that language is more than words. It is memory, knowledge, and authority. Its disappearance shows the immense cost of linguistic loss, reminding us that when a language dies, we lose an entire lens through which people understood their world, exercised power, and maintained civilization. In the silence left behind, one can sense not only the disappearance of speech, but also the fading echoes of an empire whose influence once shaped history. In the Late Bronze Age, Anatolia was home to the Hittites, a civilization whose influence extended across much of what is now central and eastern Turkey. The Hittite language, an early member of the Indo-European family, was written using cuneiform adapted from Mesopotamian traditions, a testament to the cultural and technological exchanges of the era. On May 20th, 1906, the German archaeologist Hugo Winkler and his excavation team discovered an extraordinary archive of clay tablets in Boazco, the site of the ancient Hittite capital, Hattusa. These texts, ranging from treaties and royal edicts to mythological narratives, provided unprecedented insight into a civilization that had been largely invisible in historical records. Winkler noted in his field journal that the precision and sophistication of the tablets indicated a highly literate elite whose authority was inseparable from their mastery of language. The Hittites, through their use of writing, were able to administer a vast empire, enforce law, and negotiate diplomacy with neighboring powers such as Egypt and Babylon, demonstrating that language itself was a core instrument of power. The Hittite Empire relied on a network of scribes who were trained from a young age in cuneiform and the complexities of the Hittite language. On July 13, 1915, Winkler's team also uncovered Luwian inscriptions in a hieroglyphic form carved into monumental stone, which indicated a parallel administrative and ceremonial system. Luwian, though closely related, was used primarily in public inscriptions and royal propaganda, emphasizing the adaptability of language to different spheres of influence. Together, Hittite and Luwian illustrate how multiple linguistic systems could coexist within a single empire, each serving distinct purposes, one for internal administration and the other for projecting authority across territories. Literacy, concentrated in the hands of trained elites, granted them the ability to maintain law, control religious rituals, and oversee commerce, demonstrating once again that language is inseparable from societal hierarchy and power. The decline of Hittite and Luwian languages coincided with the broader collapse of the Late Bronze Age around circa 1200 BCE, a period marked by widespread disruption across the eastern Mediterranean. Archaeological evidence shows that invasions by groups referred to as the Sea Peoples, internal rebellions, and the breakdown of long-distance trade networks destabilized the region. On October 2, 1922, Winkler published the Hittite laws found in Boazco, revealing a sophisticated legal system with detailed provisions for property, crime, and social obligations. Yet many idiomatic expressions and legal concepts remained opaque due to the absence of living speakers, demonstrating that the loss of language erases not only words, but also the cultural logic and worldview embedded within them. As Hittite and Luwian fell out of daily use, Aramaic gradually became the lingua franca, replacing these earlier languages in administration and trade, and rendering their intricate scripts relics of the past. The power of Hittite and Luwian lay in their exclusivity. Access to these languages was limited to trained scribes and officials, giving them authority over record-keeping, diplomacy, and religious ceremonies. The languages encoded the mechanisms of governance, and their loss reshaped how power was exercised. Once these languages were no longer spoken or widely understood, new elites could reinterpret, rewrite, and replace existing systems of knowledge, altering both the administration and cultural memory of the region. The disappearance of Hittite and Luwian, therefore, represents not merely a linguistic shift, but a profound reconfiguration of political and social order in Anatolia. Even after their decline, Hittite and Luwian left enduring marks on history. Comparative linguists have used Hittite texts to trace the development of the Indo-European language family, offering critical insights into linguistic evolution over millennia. Archaeologists reconstruct aspects of Hittite civilization from monumental inscriptions, administrative tablets, and religious texts, but vast swaths of cultural knowledge remain inaccessible due to the extinction of these languages. Every tablet and inscription stands as a testament to the intimate connection between words and power, demonstrating that language is both a repository of knowledge and a weapon of authority. The study of these vanished tongues also illuminates the recurring consequences of language loss. Hittite and Luwian were central to their civilization's ability to govern, preserve culture, and communicate across vast territories. When they disappeared, not only were the words lost, but the frameworks for legal reasoning, ritual practice, and historical narrative were altered or erased entirely. Modern scholarship depends on fragments and cross-references with other languages, revealing the gaps that linguistic extinction can create. In this way, the Hittite and Luwian legacy serves as a cautionary tale. Language is power, and the disappearance of a language is the disappearance of a civilization's ability to fully articulate, codify, and transmit its understanding of the world. Long before European contact, the Americas were home to thousands of languages spoken across diverse civilizations, each reflecting a sophisticated system of governance, culture, and scientific knowledge. The Maya, Zapotec, Mixtec, and Inca developed linguistic systems that were not only practical, but encoded knowledge of mathematics, astronomy, agriculture, and religious philosophy. On March 16, 1840, the explorer and linguist Stevens John Lloyd and his team documented Mayan glyphs at the site of Copan in present-day Honduras, marking one of the first systematic attempts to record these complex written traditions. These inscriptions, often carved into stone stelae or painted onto codices, recorded genealogies of rulers, ritual calendars, and sacred myths, revealing a civilization in which literacy and language were deeply intertwined with power, authority, and identity. Each glyph carried layers of meaning, and mastery of these symbols was limited to a learned elite, who controlled both religious interpretation and administrative organization, ensuring that knowledge itself became a tool of governance. The arrival of Spanish and Portuguese colonizers, beginning in 1492 CE, initiated a catastrophic disruption of these linguistic ecosystems. Through a combination of forced conversion to Christianity, imposition of European languages, and violent suppression of indigenous cultural practices, thousands of native languages were silenced within a single generation. Missionaries such as Fray Bartolomé de las Casas attempted to document and preserve certain languages for religious purposes, producing grammars and dictionaries. Yet these efforts were limited and often subordinated to the goal of conversion. The broader pattern, however, was one of systematic erasure. Native tongues were prohibited in schools, religious ceremonies, and courts, and children were punished for speaking their ancestral languages. In many cases, this suppression was deliberate, as the conquerors understood that controlling language was a means of controlling thought, cultural memory, and social cohesion. The effect was not merely the loss of words, but the destruction of entire worldviews encoded in those languages. Archaeologists and linguists have sought to reconstruct the lost linguistic landscape of pre-Columbian America, but the task is immense. In 1906, Edward Sapir published an extensive catalog of North American languages, noting that a significant number were already endangered or extinct due to centuries of colonial pressure. Among the Maya, surviving codices such as the Dresden Codex preserve astronomical observations and calendrical systems, yet much of the oral literature, mythological knowledge, and ritual instruction was irretrievably lost. These gaps demonstrate that language is not merely a vehicle for communication. It is the medium through which civilizations understand and transmit their knowledge of the world. The disappearance of these languages severed the link between generations, erasing histories and epistemologies that might otherwise have endured. The suppression of Native American languages also reveals the profound connection between language and power. By imposing European languages, colonizers were able to rewrite history, redefine social structures, and redirect the intellectual inheritance of the continent. Knowledge encoded in native languages such as agricultural techniques suited to local climates, sophisticated astronomical calculations, and legal or ceremonial codes was often dismissed as irrelevant, incomprehensible, or even heretical. The consequence was not only cultural loss, but practical disruption, the destruction of knowledge systems that had sustained thriving societies for centuries. In this context, language becomes not just a tool of communication, but a weapon in the exercise of conquest and dominance, as the ability to speak and understand a people's language equates to control over their knowledge and memory. Despite centuries of erasure, traces of these languages survived in scattered communities and codices, inspiring modern revival movements. On February 12, 1989, the Maya Cultural Council in Guatemala launched a program to teach Yucatec Maya to younger generations, preserving both its grammatical structure and vocabulary. Similar initiatives in Mexico, Peru, and the southwestern United States have sought to recover languages once considered extinct, emphasizing the resilience of human culture and the enduring power of language as a vessel for memory, identity, and authority. These revival efforts demonstrate that while language can be suppressed, its essence can survive through committed transmission, highlighting the intrinsic link between words and cultural continuity. The study of vanished American languages illustrates the devastating consequences of linguistic loss, both historically and in the present. Each erased language represents not only the disappearance of sounds and symbols, but also the erasure of entire ways of thinking, perceiving, and organizing society. By examining the historical forces that silence these tongues, conquest, cultural assimilation, and deliberate suppression, scholars gain insight into the profound influence of language on human power, governance, and cultural preservation. In the silence left behind, we are confronted with the knowledge that an entire intellectual landscape has been lost, reminding us that when a language disappears, so too does a civilization's capacity to fully articulate its understanding of the world. The European expansion into the Americas, Africa, and parts of Asia brought not only conquest and colonization, but also a systematic suppression of indigenous languages that had flourished for centuries. As explorers, missionaries, and colonial administrators advanced, they understood that controlling language was as crucial as controlling territory. In the Caribbean, following the arrival of Christopher Columbus in 1492 CE, the Taíno language, once spoken widely across Hispaniola, Puerto Rico, and Cuba, was rapidly eradicated through a combination of disease, forced labor, and cultural suppression. By December 1508, Spanish records document that Taíno communities had been decimated by epidemics and enslavement, leaving the language nearly extinct within a single generation. This rapid linguistic collapse demonstrates the lethal efficiency of combining physical conquest with cultural erasure. The loss of Taíno meant that centuries of oral histories, rituals, and local ecological knowledge were extinguished almost entirely, leaving future generations with only fragmentary records of the culture that had once dominated the Caribbean islands. In North America, the imposition of English, French, and later Spanish led to similar patterns of linguistic suppression. Boarding schools, first established in the United States during the mid-19th century, forced indigenous children to abandon their native tongues under threat of corporal punishment. On October 12, 1879, the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Pennsylvania, under the administration of Richard Henry Pratt, opened its doors with the explicit mission of assimilating Native American children into European American culture, requiring them to speak only English. Scholars and former students later documented the long-term effects. Languages that had been spoken for centuries in families and communities were forbidden, leading to generational gaps in transmission. Rituals, oral histories, and ceremonial knowledge were lost, alongside the ability to communicate naturally in these ancestral tongues. Language, in this context, was weaponized as a tool of assimilation, erasing identity and severing the continuity of cultural memory. Missionary efforts in Africa and Asia during the same period mirrored the tactics used in the Americas. Portuguese, British, and French colonial powers implemented education systems that prioritized European languages, often presenting local languages as inferior or incompatible with modern civilization. In Angola, for example, the Mbundu and Kimbundu languages faced systematic suppression as Portuguese administrators required schools and government offices to operate exclusively in Portuguese. Records from 1892 show that many children who attempted to continue speaking their native languages in school were punished or expelled. Linguists today recognize that this suppression resulted not only in lost vocabulary, but also in the erasure of indigenous knowledge systems, from agricultural practices to community governance and oral literature, demonstrating that language loss has both cultural and practical consequences. In Latin America, the Spanish crown imposed a similar model, privileging Castilian over Nahuatl, Quechua, and other indigenous tongues. On November 10, 1570, King Philip II issued a royal decree mandating that all legal and religious instruction in the Americas be conducted in Spanish, effectively criminalizing the use of native languages in official contexts. While many indigenous communities continued to speak their languages privately, the lack of formal recognition meant that literacy, administration, and religious instruction were funneled through a European linguistic lens. Over centuries, this created a situation in which many languages became endangered, existing only in isolated communities, rituals, or ceremonial contexts. Historical linguists studying colonial archives have documented that hundreds of these languages either disappeared entirely or transformed under intense external pressure, losing features critical to the original cultural knowledge they contained. The consequences of these linguistic erasures were profound. When a language disappears, it is not simply a vocabulary lost. An entire worldview, a method of encoding social relationships, spiritual beliefs, and ecological knowledge vanishes alongside it. Anthropologists studying the Americas and Africa note that oral literature, genealogical knowledge, and traditional legal practices were frequently irretrievable, surviving only in fragmented colonial records or recollections by a few elders. Language suppression was therefore an instrument of power, ensuring that colonized populations could not fully maintain their own systems of authority, knowledge, or identity. The result was a profound dislocation of memory, a cultural amnesia that made populations more dependent on colonial systems of governance and belief. Despite these catastrophic losses, traces of these languages survived in private, ceremonial, and hidden forms. On April 21, 1875, in Mexico, Father Francisco Javier Clavijero documented Nahuatl in communities around Puebla, preserving a record of vocabulary, grammar, and oral narratives that might otherwise have been lost entirely. Similarly, early ethnographers in the American Southwest recorded Hopi, Navajo, and other languages, providing a foundation for modern revival efforts. Today, linguists, cultural organizations, and indigenous activists work tirelessly to revitalize endangered languages, teaching them in schools, documenting oral traditions, and encouraging their use in daily life. These efforts underscore the resilience of human culture and the enduring truth that language is inseparable from identity, memory, and power. Even centuries after suppression, the struggle to reclaim lost words reflects a broader fight to recover control over history, culture, and knowledge itself. The 20th century marked both a continuation of language loss and the emergence of deliberate efforts to preserve endangered tongues. Globalization, urbanization, and mass education in dominant languages accelerated the decline of minority languages, while scientific and technological advances created new platforms for documentation and revival. On October 14, 1907, Franz Boas, a pioneering anthropologist, began publishing extensive field notes on the languages of the Pacific Northwest, including Kwakwala and Tsimshian. Boas recognized that these languages were rapidly disappearing due to forced assimilation policies and the encroachment of English-speaking settlers. His meticulous recordings of grammar, phonetics, and oral literature represent some of the earliest systematic efforts to capture languages on the brink of extinction, emphasizing the urgent link between documentation and survival. These early projects revealed that each language carries knowledge embedded in cultural practice, local ecology, and social organization knowledge that vanishes when a language dies. In parallel, the aftermath of World War I and II created massive demographic shifts, displacements, and cultural disruptions, further threatening minority languages in Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. On September 6, 1921, linguist Antoine Millet published a survey on the Basque language, noting its resilience in the Pyrenees despite centuries of pressure from French and Spanish authorities. Millet highlighted that while written texts could preserve certain elements of Basque culture, the loss of spoken language within communities endangered its role as a vehicle for collective memory and identity. This pattern repeated globally. Languages that once structured social, religious, and ecological knowledge were being replaced by national or colonial languages, leaving entire populations disconnected from ancestral ways of thinking. Scholars began to understand that preserving a language was not merely a linguistic act, but a political and cultural one, directly tied to the survival of traditions, histories, and power systems. The late 20th century witnessed a growing awareness of the global scope of language extinction. On March 12, 1996, the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, UNESCO, formally recognized the crisis of endangered languages, estimating that half of the world's approximately 7,000 languages would disappear by the end of the 21st century. Programs were initiated to document, archive, and teach endangered languages, often in collaboration with native communities. For example, in Australia, the Yolngu Language Revival Program, officially launched on May 3, 1995, combined traditional oral storytelling with modern recording technologies to preserve grammar, songs, and ritual knowledge. These initiatives demonstrate that language preservation requires more than recording words. It requires reintegrating language into the daily life, ceremonial practice, and educational systems of the communities that speak it. Technological advances in the 21st century have expanded the possibilities for language preservation and revitalization. Digital archives, mobile applications, and online courses allow communities to document, teach, and share their languages on a scale unimaginable to early linguists. On February 18, 2017, the Cherokee Nation launched a comprehensive language immersion program for children, combining classroom instruction with interactive digital tools to teach Cherokee vocabulary, pronunciation, and grammar. Such programs have shown measurable success, reversing decades of decline and creating a new generation of speakers. Yet despite these advances, challenges remain. Social pressures to adopt dominant languages, economic incentives, and lingering effects of past suppression continue to threaten the survival of many tongues. Language loss is not simply a linguistic phenomenon. It is a loss of intellectual frameworks, ethical systems, and cultural memory. Each language contains unique ways of understanding the natural world, structuring social life, and conceptualizing time, space, and spiritual belief. When languages vanish, entire systems of knowledge, medical practices, ecological wisdom, cosmologies are irretrievably lost. The global initiative to preserve endangered languages, therefore, is not only about words, it is about maintaining diversity of thought, cultural identity, and human knowledge. Scholars and communities alike recognize that the survival of languages is inseparable from the survival of the cultures they encode. The modern struggle to preserve endangered languages reflects a profound truth. Language is power. Just as Sumerian, Elamite, Hittite, and indigenous American languages conferred authority, shaped governance, and structured knowledge in their respective societies, contemporary languages continue to carry cultural and intellectual weight. Preservation efforts serve as acts of resistance against centuries of erasure, asserting that knowledge, memory, and identity belong to communities, not colonial powers or dominant cultures. From digital archiving projects to immersive language schools, every effort represents a reclamation of authority and continuity, ensuring that the silent disappearance of a language is not inevitable. In this way, the story of human languages past and present reveals the enduring link between words, knowledge, and the power to shape the world.